has pursued a dual strategy. On one hand, it demonstrated military strength, while on the other, it sought cooperation, détente, and disarmament on a political level. At that time, NATO's dual strategy towards Russia was described with the terms security and détente. Today, the corresponding terms are deterrence and dialogue. Deterrence is an aggressive term, while security is a defensive one.
Sicherheit ein defensiver Begriff. Dialog verkommt zur Leerformel, wenn man
Dialogue becomes an empty formula if you consider the interests of the other party illegitimate from the outset. Détente, on the other hand, represents a program, a comprehensive political approach. The difference in quality between politics then and now is evident just in the choice of terms. Speaking of choice of terms, I mentioned at the beginning that I would return to the topic of language. It is advisable, as a media consumer, to develop a certain sensitivity to language, to pay attention to word choice, and to avoid double standards. This does not only apply to the topic of Russia and Ukraine. If, for example, it involves unverified reports and it's about the good guys, it often says that such and such is apparently so and so. For the bad guys, the term apparently usually becomes the word allegedly. The doubt is then already clearly included. Or in a report about the Ukrainian advance on the Kursk region, it says that on August 8th, Ukrainian footage allegedly showed Russian soldiers surrendering. A little later in the same report, it says Russian footage is supposed to show how such and such happened. The following has nothing directly to do with Russia, but I still don't want to withhold this aspect from you.
Aber ich möchte Ihnen trotzdem diese Facette nicht vorenthalten. Wie weit ist die Verrohung gediehen?
How far has the brutalization progressed when the targeted killing of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders is referred to in the news as them being neutralized? The terms used were neutralized or even eliminated, not killed or murdered. Another example. There are established terms. This includes the illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if one is so precise in this case, why not consistently? Then it should not be called the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. That was and still is illegal under international law, but it is not referred to as such.
Das war und ist auch völkerrechtswidrig, wird aber nicht so genannt. Sie können sich sicher noch an den großen Unmut erinnern, als der ungarische Präsident
You can surely remember the great discontent when Hungarian President Viktor Orbán, right at the start of his EU Council presidency, began an intensive travel diplomacy on the topic of Ukraine. You don't have to like Orbán to recognize that this wasn't one of his worst ideas. But that's not the point now. Rather, it's about the news report stating that Orbán met with Putin, Xi, and Trump. The Ukrainian President Zelensky, whom he met first, is simply omitted. That would disrupt the lineup of villains, so they just leave him out. With such means, whether automatic or deliberate, the very idea of reaching a solution is scorned.
Wird allein die Idee, zu einer Lösung zu kommen, verächtlich gemacht. Denn was kann man schon erwarten bei Putin, Xi und Trump?
What can one expect from Putin, Xi, and Trump? Perhaps this, because it shows how much the mood in our country has changed. At the end of July, the Minister-President of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Manuela Schwesig, was asked about a possible Olympic bid by Germany as the current president of the Bundesrat. The last question to her was whether she thought it was right that Germany should not participate in the Games in Paris. Ms. Schwesig replied that the Olympic Games stand for peace. Therefore, it is right that Russia does not participate. How great must the pressure be for someone like Manuela Schwesig to make such a statement? If you take her wording seriously, then a whole range of other nations should also not participate.
Dann dürften eine ganze Reihe anderer Nationen auch nicht teilnehmen. Aber
But she must be careful not to make herself vulnerable with an ill-considered comment on Russia, as she is still criticized for her political support of Nord Stream 2. Currently, one cannot talk about Russia and Ukraine without mentioning the missile deployment in Germany planned for 2026. Some are firmly convinced that this will enhance our security. Others believe the opposite is true. It will not surprise you that I am among those who consider these plans a dangerous escalation. I would like to explain why in the following. The issue of deployment has at least two aspects: a military or security policy aspect and a democratic one. I will start with the democratic aspect.
Und ich fange mal mit dem Demokratischen an. Beim NATO-Doppelbeschluss 1979, als es die Aufstellung von
In 1979, during the NATO double-track decision, which involved the deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, not just in Germany, there was an intense parliamentary and societal debate. Even within NATO, there was controversial discussion. It took 4 years for the parliament to approve the deployment of the Pershing missiles, accompanied by the largest demonstrations Germany had ever experienced. Today, the situation is different. Unexpectedly, on the sidelines of the NATO summit on July 10th in Washington, a joint declaration by the USA and Germany is released. It states that starting in 2026, as part of the planning for their future permanent deployment, the United States of America will temporarily station long-range weapon systems of their multi-domain task force in Germany. These conventional units will include SM-6, Tomahawks, and currently developing hypersonic weapons when fully developed. These weapons have a significantly greater range than the current land-based systems in Europe. However, this far-reaching decision is not mentioned in the final declaration of the NATO summit. Instead, the declaration emphasizes NATO's commitment to arms control and disarmament. That's quite peculiar. Aside from the fact that there was no debate about this deployment decision, and there really isn't one, various questions arise. Why only in Germany this time?
Wieso diesmal nur in Deutschland? Anfang der 80er Jahre wurden Pershings, wenn ich nicht irre, in 5 verschiedenen europäischen.
In the early 1980s, Pershings were stationed in 5 different European countries, if I'm not mistaken. Who then has command authority? Only the USA? Does Germany at least have a veto, or are the missiles just stationed with us? And there's more to it. Although the impression is given that it is a joint decision, a closer look reveals something quite different. My colleague Wolfgang Lieb has meticulously compiled the exact details. You can find that on the internet, but I'll roughly outline the relevant facts for you now. Even under Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the USA fundamentally decided on such a deployment.
Grundsätzlich für eine derartige Stationierung entschieden. Ab 2017 unter Trump wurde mit dem Aufbau einer militärischen.
Starting in 2017 under Trump, the US Army began building a military task force structure. And that's the crucial point. Since April 13, 2021, long before the Russian attack on Ukraine, concrete preparations have been underway. It was decided to station one of the 5 multi-domain task forces in Wiesbaden. In other words, and I now quote my colleague Lieb, it was a long-prepared unilateral decision by the USA. The connection with the Russian attack on Ukraine is more about using the fear of Putin to stifle or prevent public discussion.
Putin eine öffentliche Diskussion zu lähmen oder zu unterbinden. Dem ist nichts hinzuzufügen. Und den ausführlichen Artikel kann ich nur empfehlen.
There is nothing to add to that. I can only recommend the detailed article. If we now change perspectives and look at the whole thing from Moscow's point of view, it becomes interesting. With hypersonic weapons reaching 17 times the speed of sound, the warning time is drastically reduced. What are the strategic implications of this? Does Moscow perceive this in the current tense situation as a defensive measure by the West, or rather as preparation for a surprise attack?
Oder doch eher als Vorbereitung für einen Überraschungsangriff? Und wenn damit dann zu rechnen ist, wäre es dann aus Moskau.
And if it is to be expected, wouldn't it be better from Moscow's perspective to take preventive action against it? Whether preventive or as a retaliatory strike, it will take place in densely populated German areas. As early as 1968, a military expert from the SPD pointed out in a book that land-based systems belong in Alaska, Greenland, or some deserts, but certainly not in densely populated areas. In any case, I don't understand how this action is supposed to increase our security. Frankly, I also don't understand why people here aren't taking to the streets en masse to protest against it. The younger generation, for whom peace has apparently become something taken for granted, is so focused on climate change that there is no room left for the issue of war and peace. It should be clear to everyone, if peace doesn't work out, especially considering nuclear weapons, then the climate doesn't matter anymore either.
Vor allen Dingen angesichts der Nuklearwaffen, dann ist mit dem Klima auch schon egal.
It's difficult to end on a positive note with this topic. I'll try anyway. If we remember what is possible in terms of détente policy, we only need to think of the beginning of the new German Ostpolitik. This began immediately after the Soviet Union brutally crushed the democracy movement in Czechoslovakia in 1968. One could have said, we won't talk to them. Or as it's said today, you shouldn't talk to such people. We need to teach them a lesson so that such actions don't go unpunished. But that's precisely when you should talk. The result of the new Ostpolitik is well known. For decades, there were only advantages for all involved, both humanitarian and economic. That's where we need to return.
Sowohl humanitär als auch wirtschaftlich. Da müssen wir wieder hin.
And anyone who is convinced of this should not hide their opinion. That can sometimes be uncomfortable, I know. You also can't rule out being quickly pigeonholed into a category where you don't belong. But that shouldn't stop you. Perhaps the sentence by the cabaret artist Andreas Rebers helps. If I say something right that pleases the wrong people, then the right thing doesn't automatically become wrong. I will now phrase the following somewhat solemnly. We owe it to our system, if we want to preserve it, our democratic system, not to hide our respective opinions, regardless of what they are. We should do everything to ensure that this opinion is based as much as possible on information and not on ideologically driven beliefs.
Und nicht auf ideologisch bedingten Überzeugungen.
A society that is justifiably proud of its constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech must cultivate a culture of debate. Otherwise, the theoretically guaranteed freedom of speech is worthless. People need to feel that it is perfectly normal to argue decently, in both senses of the word. I started with a quote, and would like to end with one as well. This time from Jean-Paul, the German writer who was even older than Heinrich Heine. He said, "One may be foolish with the permission of the authorities, but not wise without it." Thank you.
Aber nicht ohne sie klug. Ich danke Ihnen.